Today we are going to have the guest speakers. And as I have introduced to you, the first one will be Jeffrey. And then his background currently is the ABD, is actually working on the dissertation, doctoral dissertation in the City University of Hong Kong. And when he was at IMIX, I was the supervisor of the thesis. And so he is going to share the deal screening and the crisis communication in the context of Indonesia. The other one is Fabi. Fabi just graduated last year, and Fabi will be with us at 3 o'clock, I think. And then she's going to talk about Indonesian journalistic practices in the newsroom when they combat the fake news challenges. So before that, we are going to talk about your coming up assignment in week 6. So week 6, you will have the proposal due. So basically, you will have the presentation and a short proposal will be written. But we can discuss whether the written part can be actually compensated, it's like complemented by the PPT, because we have very small size. And then also, I think this year I sort of moved the proposal to early day, because later on we will have maybe some structure for the 2 other lecturers in Philippines and in Singapore to join us. Sorry about that. I still haven't heard from the R&D department of NCCU. So we're still on the general plan. But week 6 will be the day that you are going to present your proposal topic. Okay. So basically, the proposal will focusing on new media, because the title of our class basically is about new media. Whether you want to talk about convergence, it depends. But in terms of new media, it could be you study the new ICT or the media technologies and how they shape the media organizations or user. So basically, it's how technology influence the user in organization or the society. Or you want to do user study, that's fine. And the other one will be more like new media development and the impact on industry, professional practices, societal or individual users. So basically, one is how they shape the traditional ways of doing things. And the other one is totally just looking at the new media or technologies. Okay? I think it has very broad areas that you can think about your topic, but I would suggest right now we actually have the students overseas in different countries. So in the past, I would suggest students form the group, will be 2 to 3 people, and then to collect data. And I think at the current structure, to be more feasible, I think it's okay. You can have a smaller size, like one student, like Lucas, you are in Germany. I don't know whether you would like to team up with other students, but I think maybe difficult. Yeah, so if that's the individual assignment, then I would suggest you to think about a mixed method. Mixed method means, for instance, later on we will discuss your Facebook post about using certain theoretical model, like we use the 6 forces model to looking at the certain innovation, could be new media, right? Like you pick like a Netflix or YouTube. So basically you can use a specific case and technology and to collect a more like secondary data, which is document analysis. That's not really an easy job, because if you want to do something is up to date, yeah, you have to really juggle on the latest development and the information, and they are quite messy, and you will need to find out what actually is the truthful data or the current development. And you can complement it with the second method. Like, okay, later on I'm going to share with you my studies with social technical system theory that we introduced like last week, right? And also I will talk about the 6 or 7 forces model, how to work together to help that. So I have the data analysis about the documents. Also, I have the interview data of the experts in Shanghai or experts in your country. Then that would be good. That you don't have to have a big size of like user study, or the size can be smaller, but it will be a mix. So the mix can actually give you very rich insights. Okay. So the presentation initially I said will be 10 minutes, and then now we can have 15 minutes at most for the presentation. So 10 to 15 minutes, and followed by the QA. Okay. So we will, when you finish the presentation, also we'll expect it that you have the proposal uploaded, the e-copy to Moodle discussion area, and you have the printout. Certainly, Lucas, you don't have to submit a printed copy, but a student in class, if they can submit a print copy. Okay, so now we will start with your 6 force model theory assignment. So this morning I have checked what you have written, and also I think it will be good if you can interact it with each other. So it's good that you have posted your answer before time, be punctual, but at the same time you also ask questions to your classmates. Yet, usually on the Facebook, we will answer the questions, meaning you have to respond it to the comment. There will be something I still have to remind you to do so. Okay. So here, I jot down some points for you. I think the structure to answer the question will start with what kind of new media or ICT you have selected, and the context. Yeah. And then some of you just jump into the technology, like Melissa talked about the e-reader, but did not talk about a little bit background and the time or the context that she is examining the technology. Then I think this is necessary. You have to give the background or the what you are looking at. And some of you quite spend time elaborate what actually means, refer to the 6 forces theory and who actually Michael Porter most cited, and then the year and the historical background. I think if you only have 500 words, that may not be the very important thing for you. But to demonstrate that you can use the theory's 6 forces, the 6 different aspects, and how you understand them by putting or classify your analysis under each force will be very, very important. So this time I think Rona demonstrates a good practice for the Netflix case, because she clearly talked about is looking at the Taiwan's Netflix, and also listed 6 different top components when the framework has been used to analyzing the specific industry or specific organizational cases in the industry. Okay. So I would suggest you maybe can take a look at her answer, and to understand maybe that will be the direction for the future modification. Of course, I think Lucas also analyzing Netflix, and then you give a good, I would say based on the 6 forces, you give some, I would say, contextual informations in terms of Germany in the different forces. I think that's also good, but maybe I think in terms of the depth or the so-called the reason provided, I think maybe need to improve a little bit, but you also on the right track. We talk about the students here, so I would say Esther, you mentioned about YouTube, and YouTube certainly, I think it may not be a very easy case to actually elaborate because YouTube looks a very giant media platform. So it's not just a media. There will be like multiple types of media forms there. So when you talk about YouTube in Taiwan, then you have to really identify who actually is the competitor, who is, the end user will be easy for you, but who are the suppliers and who are the maybe the substitutes. So these things need to be very clear, okay? So end up with the conclusion is that based on the 6 forces, then you will give some projection about this specific technology in future. Right now, you may locate your selected media or the technologies in some point of time. Because last time, when I said you discuss about innovative, the disruption, you will choose once upon a historical time. But if right now you are going to write a new paper, then unless you want to do something about history, but this is not the scope of this class. So what you are going to develop will be something today. And even after this class, then you still have the opportunities to maybe present the paper in a conference. So you have to write something which is latest development. So if that's the contest, then I think you will have to make lots of effort. They won't be able to really give you lots of background, no matter it's Netflix today, okay? Or because only organizations will withhold that kind of latest information. So that's why if you can get access to the latest, the secondhand data, but you still have to complement something new, something only available to your study. What I'm saying is that you have to really think about your research question. If you want to working on more like organizational level, you probably need to access to organization expert. User study tend to be easier. Usually people think, oh, I can just ask the YouTube user or Netflix users. Thinking about if I want to ask about maybe someone working at YouTube, that will be much more difficult. But just think about the value, okay? And also the representative. So if thinking about the value is if harder the data to be collected, actually the value of your research or your contributions will be also higher. So think about that, okay? So you need to juggle the balance between something is the value, the contribution, and something about feasibility or accessibility. So that's the things you need to juggle. And if you definitely want to do something about user, then thinking about who should be the user, they definitely have to have the prior experience. And if you are just as a very ordinary technologies or media, then won't be very insightful, right? Because you can just check out, ask your friend or the neighbors and then just say, oh, did you watch YouTube last night? So everyone seems, will have some sort of, a habit to check or not habit, at least watch it. Then why this topic or these people will be the very important persons to be interviewed. So you have to keep asking yourself, if I only can ask a few people with certain important questions and who they should be in relation to your topic. Okay, so let's go back to 6 forces model. So basically the 6 forces model want to help you to understand the strategy and in terms of certain industry or organization in how to compare their market competitiveness and the commercial viabilities. So these are the 6 forces that you should or you have analyzed. Okay, so bargaining power of customers is something we get more familiar. So that's about user, right? And threat of new entrants. Some of you talk about new entrants, but who are the new entrants? The technologies that you analyze shouldn't be part of, the examples or the so-called new entrants, because you have to think about the new entrants actually compete with the selected case. Okay, and I saw some of the maybe misunderstanding in the answer to of your classmates, and thinking about the supplier, who would be the supplier in terms of Netflix? Disney. Yeah, suppliers means who actually provide you the content, who provide you the infrastructure, who actually have to be part of the ecology to support you. I mean, the selected cases that you have to function. So these are the suppliers. You cannot live without them. So that's why I say it's quite difficult to analyze YouTube, because it's a global businesses. Even looking at Taiwan, we have dozens or more than dozens of 2 million subscribers YouTuber, but that's only looking at a specific like KOL or celebrity in Taiwan. But they also traditional media. There are other like professional med user generated content. So there are so many people in terms of even content, right? So it's not easy to analyze. If looking at the Netflix, of course you can check. I think Lucas may not have the same content line up if looking at Taiwan's Netflix. So if you are interested in doing Netflix together, there will be a good cross-country comparison. Then that could be something that we could work together. Okay, yeah. But what I'm saying is that, so content-wise, you can analyze in the lineup, and or maybe you can think about particularly in terms of the so-called creators, meaning only specific in this country, or the co-production model working with this country's content producer. So there are so many things that you can do. Okay, these are the suppliers. Could be from different countries, the broadcaster, cable TV, or those people in the film industry. So they still have a lot of people in the supplier chain. But I think that's also very, very meaningful that we cannot live without is the central part, is the competitive rivalry. Who actually are the key competitors to you? So you have to ask yourself. So I would like to ask maybe, so Rona, because you mentioned Lee TV is the #1 OTT in Taiwan, right? So do you think Lee TV definitely will be the top competitor for the Netflix in Taiwan?
It's hard to say, but I think they are doing a dual model with free with ads and also subscription, which could be the advantage. But I'm not sure, because I also mentioned that right now Taiwanese the average subscription is 1.7. It's not over 2 yet. So I think I'm not sure if Taiwanese people will be willing to pay for more than 2 platforms in the future. So with free access. Yes, free access. Be one of the.
Okay, so you will have to, even just focusing on so-called competitors, you need to really think about who actually can compete. And then you also mentioned about in Taiwan in the past, we have iQIYI from China. But whether from China, there's the Chinese versions of content, will it be the top competitor to the Netflix? So you can think about, they are even identifying one part of the forces, then you need a lot of time to think. Okay, so that's why you can use the model actually to help you framing and write a very good study. Okay, so here's some backgrounds about from the 5 forces to 6 forces, and later on I will introduce 7 forces. So we will always expand. So Porter's 5 forces, you have been familiar, like the top 5, right? And adding 1 in the in the 6 will be complementary product. So what is complementary or complementary products? Then you have analyzed. So complementary products will be alliances. So who actually can help you be part of the ecology, and sometimes there could be the regulator. So who actually are good complementary to this ecology. So let me change to, okay. All right, so 7 forces model is one more. So the 6 is complementer. Complementer has been added in 1995 and talk about it's more like strategic alliances. Or you can think about who actually can support you in terms of business interests or product support. And the 7th force is initiated by, I think it's from Asia, and looking at Sun Zi Bing Fa, which is a very ancient ways of Sun Wu, I think militarist in a very ancient China. So they're thinking about distribution or retailers. It's like those people who help you, like the satellites, to help you to actually distribute your services or your products. So like the channels or how to resources being allocated or how to optimize the whole process. Okay. So if we're looking at your answer, we just shortly mentioned that I suggest to looking at maybe Lauren's answer, because what she has done has a good demonstrations in terms of this forces assignment, looking at Netflix. And I checked with her before the class, and then she said, because she has done something about OTT last semester. So he got lots of background insights. And clearly to put the right components in the right places. That's very important. Yeah. So maybe we can easily understand the competition, but who is the key competitor? We still need to think clearly in terms of who actually identify as the more like the important similarities or in terms of the service they provided. And new entrants won't be you, but someone newer than you. Or otherwise, if they are not newer than you, they should be called as substitutes, right? There could be substitute services instead of new entrants. And user, it's good to thinking about the switch over, like a switching cost, because they may not use multiple services, but use one. So thinking about will there be a lot of expenses if they want to switch like the mobile phone plan. Now right now you subscribe maybe Zhonghua Telecom, and then you feel like, oh, that's 1 or 2 year contract. If you need to switch to another one because the phone, the better bundle services they provided, so you may need to pay something to Zhonghua Telecom to switch over. So these are all the costs that you need to think whether it will be a good idea to do so. Okay, so the end user will keep thinking about switching costs or the cost issues per se, or the content attractiveness and lots of things. Suppliers we talk about are those people who provide the infrastructures or the content or services to help you to build up your own operation. Substitutes is the alternatives. Other than you, who else actually can give you, even they may not look similar. And they could be something different, but they have the potential. So I look at Miming's answer talking about line. And then you mentioned about substitute could be the clubhouse.
Yes, in the first week.
And this week?
This week I didn't talk more about that because I remember Esther said something different. She thinks that Clubhouse cannot really replace Line. And I sort of agree. I feel like it's only replacing some parts, but not, of course, not all of them.
So who will be your substitutes that you identify?
I think now there's like all of these other apps, they can replace some part offline function, but I didn't find one that can replace completely each function of line.
WeChat.
Um,
Could be.
but not in Taiwan.
Oh,
But if you talk about WeChat or WhatsApp, they are still similar, but not that
Not completely.
highly penetrated. I think that could be substitute because if you want to say that's competitors, they will be equally strong and have very high potential risk for your business. But substitute could be something that you notice there's a similarity and it may not be that similar, but could be something they can think of, or even some people I don't remember who write about could be some entertaining business like gaming. Is that Lucas? You said you're a substitute.
Yes, I was
For the
talking about
Netflix.
streaming.
Yes. So yeah, substitutes will be something else. Also popular could be some entertaining or pleasure actually can sort of replace Netflix, right? So that's how you actually framing your answer. So I think that's also good. So TikTok, you mentioned about TikTok. Is that your answer? Yes, right?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So you can looking at your classmates' answer and thinking about your answer. Because I think follow the structure, at least you have to identify the 6 different forces and what they are and put the right components or content inside. And I carefully read Ari's answer, but some parts I think may need to rethink because the forces are there, but some of the answers I may not think that's truly, for instance, you talk about competition and you give the statistics, then I have no idea what kind of competition that you mentioned. It's sort of describe how successful, podcasts or things like that in your selected market, but you have to identify who is the top rivalries that you think of in the podcast. Okay, in the market that you select. Okay, so like competition actually is the competitors, not competition. Okay, you have to identify the competitor. Okay, like you write about, I think suppliers is okay because you talk about the different parts of maybe products that have to support the podcast. But new entrants also need to think because I did not see how you really identify that. So you have to be specified, specify your answer more clearly, okay? So Ming, yours, I think, but what I actually copy will be something, is your homework too, yes. But you write about Clubhouse. Why? You still mention about Clubhouse. You said new entrants, not substitutes, but new entrants. So you will need to provide some reason why you think the new entrance of the Clubhouse could be the force actually shaping the development of lie. And I think in the very beginning, you need to think about what is lie. If lie is something that Aries answer talking about the substitutes, lie to him is it's a app actually can provide you for multimedia communication. So you can share different kinds of content, text, voice call, or the video, and so on and so forth. And they can have the photo album. But last time Esther talked about Lie Pay, right? So Lie is more than just the communication app, but also have the wallet or has some shops that you can have discount. So you have to specify which part of Line. Line TV will be something, maybe the competitor to Netflix or Lee TV, that's OTT. So you have to dissect, be more specific. Yes, because Line is huge, just like YouTube is huge. Then there won't be advantage to you when you talk about your analysis. Okay? So in the very beginning, when you were not here, I talk about the week 6, we will have to have the topic proposal. And the size of people we have right now, if you want to do individual work, it's okay. Yeah. And also I would suggest you, because I emphasize the importance of the new data, but you need to think about if you are just 1 to 2 people, then how much data you can collect. So the size won't be a very important thing. If you ask me the quality of the paper to be presented in an international conference, if you're looking at the user, and I think the user, at least you will have like 20, right? Or even 30. If I suggest a student, any of the professional, like if you want to publish, but I won't suggest you here because it's not realistic. Yet you need to think about if I have the interviewees like Asper, if I have 2 or 3 and they are key person and very difficult to access and they withhold very important and valuable information, I think that's good. Or even 1 or 2, but you have to demonstrate how important. And not just that interview, you will have supplemented with lots of documents to analyzing what's the latest development. So there will be a mixed method in terms of just based on 1 or 2 people interview to come up with your final outcomes. Okay. If in terms of survey, if you are a team, I would say, oh, definitely you have to 200 people more than to be publishable. But for this class, I won't ask you to do that. It's cruel. That's not possible. So how about you try your best to have like a little bit like a 100 or less than 100, because you have to demonstrate the way how you come up with your quantitative data, right? And I know you probably will go through like a convenient sample and put it on the website or put it on the social media. It's okay, but they still will be, you have to think about how the data collection method will be legitimate, to the way how you explain your data and then to your topic. Okay. So let's quickly go back because I talk about the importance to looking at the mixed method, and the document analysis could be very important to you because that will be important part of the data. Then my early stage, I also working on the emerging technologies and the more like a macro level. So I use the social technical analysis. So I think that's what we're talking about, social technical analysis, the systems, right? Did I? Talking about they are triangle, and then later I will explain more. So this one, I working on the Singapore context. I have some comparison paper about Singapore and Taiwan, and I also working on the China, the CMMB, and publish several papers here listed. So let's just recap. What is the macro level of social technical system theories? So we need to looking at the 3 very important subsystems of the technologies, the technology, market, industry, and user, and the government policy. And since we believe that human in the subsystem actually make the decision and then shape, they have the conflicts, they have the interests, they have different perception of the technologies and how the emerging technologies will actually should be or will be developed. So they are lots of shaping powers and the key holders, key stakeholders, the key actors in the subsystem, you have to identify them. If you want to ask someone like experts, so were you focusing, okay, like here I listed AI social bots is my recent 3-year project that I'm working on. So I identified maybe the technology system of the social bots, who will be this person. And those people who actually, the ICT experts who developed certain, they have the chatbot developer. It could be someone, if looking at more malicious ways of using social bots, there will be some hackers that you have to ask them. So these people actually are important experts who can answer your question, including like a mix. I would say a person who can answer both is the Andrew Tan. Andrew Tan could be in the so-called government, sector, because he played a role to bridge the technologist, IT person, and also the government. She is very special. So basically, the government will also identify who. If talking about fake news, there are some government sectors has the officers who actually be responsible for that. So you need to thinking about all possible person, and they are the key persons in each subsystems, and try to, no matter is try to looking at all the latest reports and the news, and then to see what they have expressed, and better off you can get access to that. Okay, but no matter what, you have to know who actually have the voice and have the power in each subsystems to shape the whole development or trajectory of the technology. Okay, so I have worked on like mobile broadband, mobile broadcasting TV, or the 5G technology can also be used using this kind of social technical model. So here a little bit more. In the very beginning, when people talk about social technical system analysis, they are more looking at information system in the organization. So there'll be two parts. One is the technical parts. The other is people in the organization, how they shape each other. Like last time I mentioned about digital newsroom, right? It's a co-decision process to see how the newsroom technology has been implemented in the organization. But later on, the South Korea professors, I think several of them, develop different kinds of paper. They're using the macro levels to apply the social technical system analysis. Like Han using the social technical to looking at the broadband technologies, and eventually say ICT policies after the whole analysis is the driving forces instead of market, industry, user, but policy is more important to the case. Okay, and also some of them predict the mobile environment, and Shane is the paper that I look sort of as the initial model for my 2011 paper. The paper I worked with Professor Liu Youli when she was sabbatical in Nanyang Technological University. So we did a comparison studies in the very early like mobile broadcasting TV trials in Singapore and Taiwan. So what exactly Shing in 2006 has done? Just 2006 at a time, people still has lots of debates in terms of what kind of standard to be the terrestrial TV, digital terrestrial TV. So she looking at the Korean's contest, and then the standard is called DMB, okay? And then analyzing whether DMB would take off, will become the dominant technological standard in South Korea. So he analyzing the technical subsystem, like looking at infrastructure, the standards and the equipment, and looking at a social system, including market, customers, industry, and regulation, okay? And eventually it comes up with a triangle and talk about the adoption of the DMD basically is will be a technology push because technology is ready and the business model may be different between because the broadcasters and telecos. So this is my paper and looking at Singapore's case. So you will develop something like a subsystem, like a three triangle, and each is not just located in that subsystem, but they also interact with each other. So you are looking at how policy and technologies, they have some interdependency or interactions. That's something like a technology neutral approaches at that time they propose. It's like it really depends what kind of, they don't want to regulate a standard because you can choose any standards as long as the industry will like it. But that is not the same in South Korea. South Korea have definitely set a standard for the industry to develop. So you can looking at different size of subsystem and analyzing based on your document and based on your experts' remarks, and then you can see each subsystem and what kind of forces influencing them and whether they are dominant. And in between, they are also something related. Okay, is that clear? For instance, right now the policy, like policy making reflect the diverse view from the key stakeholders, because they could be from the telcos, they could be from the broadcasters, they could be from the cable industries. They all have different interests. So you need to write something about your analysis and have some like a short summaries in terms of the key findings and looking at eventually who actually will be the push forces. To this study, I would say policy has been delayed, and industry definitely are the driving forces to push the whole development. Technology is ready, but eventually the technology did not come to market because after a few years, the government just launched the code to ask for people to participate. But the market trials has been uh, finished like 4 years. So all the industry operators, they lose the interest about the new technologies. So it's a similar triangle, but looking at different cases, it's not like you just draw a triangle, but you will have a lot of analysis and come up with the conclusion, almost the final of the analysis. So this is the case of CMMB, which is the broadcasting TV in China. So another paper. And you can use the frameworks talking about individual subsystems and what happened there. Who are the stakeholders? What did they do? What did they say? Like this one, the industry focusing on Shanghai. One is focusing on Shanghai. The other one I focusing on Beijing with two different papers. So like something like multiple, like at the bottom, the technology and market industry said multiple technological standards delay the market rollout because they have like a more than, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 different kind of standards, and each of them back up with the R&D companies and different even universities or industries because they want to fight for the market. Okay. Lucas, are you still following me? So I'm just explaining how actually you can use the data to thinking about the three subsystems and then identify the stakeholders. And then based on the documents you collected or the interview data, you will come up with your analysis. And then looking at the different shape in between, like market industry or market and governments or technology and the market, and see how they interact with each other. So we have read this one. Okay, this is the final one. Just quickly explain. So sometimes my previous paper is using social technical, and just after 1 or 2 years, I have to develop another paper, but with a different set of experts. One is from Shanghai and one is from Beijing. They have different characteristics, okay? But still, if we're looking at the triangle, then the policy and government won't change too much. And what you should focusing on is the subsystem that develop faster and with lots of different insights. So that's why I integrate the social technical model with the 7 forces, because 7 forces will be more appropriate to looking at the market per se or industry. And I also add the component of culture. So if you're looking at so-called here is still the idea or the shape of the triangle. But later on, I particularly looking at the market industry and the 7 different forces. For instance, the competitor rivalry will be negative to the CMMB business, and why. You will have to identify the rivalries and then the whole analysis why it actually won't help the rollout. Okay, or looking at the consumers, because consumer may not get used to this new technology yet. They only have the kickoff in the Olympic Games, and only have very few device can receive the content, and still very scarce content provided. So you will have lots of analysis and said, okay, customer-wise, based on all the analysis and your data, you don't really see that's a positive or the strengths of the technologies. Or eventually you will have the 7 different forces. And then after that, you can identify which are the key forces. And then based on these plus and the minus, or the strengths and the weakness, eventually at this moment, what kind of forecast you have for this technology to be diffused in a country like China. Okay. All right. So let's just pull back. Okay. So what I'm suggesting you is that maybe based on the macro level of analysis, you are interested in particular country and emerging technologies. What I just suggest you, I will provide the papers for you. You can look into how actually I wrote the paper with the 7 forces model plus the social technical system, or just the social technical system and cross-country comparison. Okay. Then that would be good that you're thinking about macro level and the plus document analysis and some expert interview, or you want to looking at user per se. But going back to the basic question, so what is research? I think the most difficult part in the very beginning is how to thinking about a good topic that's worthwhile, you know, and investing your time and effort, and a good topic that you can finish. That's the 2 different extremes, but always that's loss and fun. Okay, and everyone has to go through that process. Even now, me, every new research have to go through. Maybe I have more experiences, I can shorten that period of time, but if you are too sure about your topic, that may not be a good thing, because they may not be as like a groundbreaking or innovative, or, you know, so you need to have a balance. So what you need to do first, of course, find a research topic, and how to do that. You have to review the existing studies related to your topics. Otherwise, you may repeat the same thing, or you just write a paper, basically did not add any addition to the existing knowledge.
So a research topic is not a question. It's
No.
more like a area that I want to explore.
It's the title. It's the title of your paper, right? That's the topic. But in the topic, you may have several research questions related to how you answer that topic. Okay? And so develop not just could be if the is very important and you have sub questions under, but usually it's maybe 2 to 3, I think is a good number. Depends on how much time you can finish and the broadness or focus of your question being framed. And of course, you will have to find the methodology and the design to answer your question. And later on, you have to think, okay, that's the method. So what kind of data I'm going to collect, and how can I collect? And after the collection, you will have to analyze the data, and finally to write a conclusion and how to think about presenting your findings. Okay, so that's the, yes.
Regarding the interviews, I saw the paper on Pokemon Go from Moodle. Do we need to transcribe interviews we conduct?
Oh, you mean, okay, if you are doing the interview, right? No matter it's expert interview or as user interview, yes, if you're talking about very rigorous, you know, process, I think usually you will say, I will transcribe the interview data, and then I will record and then transcribe for the data analysis. So that's very standard process. if you are writing the thesis, then certainly you will have attached that transcript in the end. I don't know whether it's required in Germany, but in Taiwan,
yes, it is.
yes. So if to me, I think I still will have to know that you truly collect your data, okay? So, but transcription in the semester, even though now we have some like device to help you, it's like they have the auto transcriptions, but still you have to pay and that's some effort. So at least you have to attach the audio files you will record, right? And you will have highlights. So that's one part in terms of the preliminary data analysis. That will be 10%. Then at that point, you will have to at least provide some evidence about audio file and then the highlights of the bullet points of your findings, but not word by word transcription, because I think that's a lot of work. You may not be able to finish. But if you can do that, that would be great. I did not say that's not a good idea. I think that's a very standardized and a very solid way to approach that. So thinking about your topic, whether it's worthwhile to do, like I think lots of time people thinking about very broad topic, but to do a good research, you need to thinking about very something more focused. Okay, and thinking about are you going to answer certain important questions to solve problems, and can the proposed question or problems being investigated through your resources and your capabilities, and also thinking about how to collect data. Like organizational data, you may not be able to get access, then that's a no. But if they open the door for you, that's certainly yes. So I don't know what kind of resources and background or the previous experiences that you have. So you need to think, okay? So you may contribute to theory, but I think to this class, they may not be the only way to make contributions. You can think about a practical application. If you're looking more like a business managerial, then you will suggest to specific groups like practitioners how to thinking about social marketing and strategies and some recommendations, or you want to suggest to policies. So these are more practical contributions. Yeah, and then you could do something about innovation, social transformation as an even higher goal. And in what way that your studies will make people feel interesting? Okay, is that something new, something surprise? And we talk about looking at the existing paper because you can know what kind of things has been done and what are the important findings found in the past studies. And so also what else left that you can focus on. Okay, so there are lots of reasons you cannot jump, from your topic and then directly to collect data. But because everything will be just in your brain, and then you imagine you are the only one who know and then feel interested in this specific topic. But we know that's not really something too fresh under the sun. So maybe, your other people have done something similar. So why you make the repeated effort? Okay, so we can keep discussing about from the topic and how you want to do and why you want to do. Okay, but if we talk about rigorous, that will be something related to the method. Okay. Like the second one talking about spending enough time in the field. If you are taking an ethnographic approach, certainly you will have to immerse yourself in the field, or you're doing observation, you have to spend time. But not necessarily when you are doing survey. But still, you have to think whether your data is saturated. But that is more for the full paper. But at this moment, in this class, you will have smaller sample because considering of your time for just 18 weeks and only by 1 to 2 people, then I won't force you to do a full scale of research. That's not reasonable. Okay, but you need to think about if I can, based on what I have done here, or me and my friend have done here, then I can expand the data set in future. Then I still have good potential to publish this paper or present the paper to future conferences. That would be a good thing. So this is the structures that you are going to follow. I will also upload the past, maybe past work from the same class, okay, but they may not have the same size of people. It could be like 3 people's work, so you don't be stressed, but just give you an idea what they have done, and then maybe just good papers that I will give you the examples. Okay. So I'll give you these slides because we will follow with 2 sharing. I couldn't keep postponed their sharing. So just read and then think about the last 2 pages, 3 pages. We will talk about them next time. But I want you to think about your topic. So this is your assignment for this week. But assignment, you don't need to write a lot. I just want you to think. Okay, you can talk to your classmate if you want to work with certain person, because 1 to 2 people, right? Think about your topic, and then thinking about all the, bullet points or anything that you feel concerned. But I would suggest you to think more focused topic. And before think about your topic, you need to do environmental scanning, meaning you at least can use like Google Scholar or Google or database search for the keywords that you want to examine, and then try to differentiate your research from what has been done. And thinking about the context. Context could be country. Context could be which organization or which case or which technology. Okay? Then we will have more in-depth discussion next week after you start to think and write down some basic of your thoughts. Don't write a lot, but I want you to think. At least the topic, and maybe I'll give you structure, but the topic and some key papers maybe you already look for, or based on what you want to do this, and then your proposed method. Just 3, like introduction, right? What's your topic? What you want to do, and the key references. That based on that, I'm going to do this because I want to make an advancement based on that study, or that study give me the idea. So I'm going to do something different. I don't know. So you have to read first, and then finally how to do with the method. Okay. So I go a bit fast, but are you still following me at this moment? Because I think this class we have very 60% were allocated to the research paper. So that's why today I have to go through, if you want to do macro documents analysis, and then with some interview could be using like social technical framework or 74064 forces. But I don't limit you with the so-called theoretical framework. You can use anything else. Okay. All right. So now I think we can have a 10 minutes break. And then after that, Jeffrey will be with us, and he's going to share his experiences in terms of the paper that he have developed with me. Okay. So break. So today Jeffrey is with us, and then so basically now he's going to share a dual screening and the crisis communication in Indonesia. So demonstrating this study, at the same time he also will talk about his experiences in terms of how to conduct a new media research. Let's give him a hand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much, Professor Lin. So good afternoon again, everyone. Thank you very much for having me today. It's certainly a really great pleasure to be able to meet you, although in this virtual setting. Let me introduce myself once again. I'm Jeffrey from City University of Hong Kong. And today, Professor Lin wants me to share my research experience. But just to let you know that I am by no means an expert in research, as I'm also still learning and even still guided by Professor Lin. Yet, hopefully, to some extent, today's sharing can be helpful for you. And to help contextualize my sharing, I will also talk about a paper that I worked with Professor Lin, which we presented in IMCR conference back in 2018, entitled Dual Screening and Crisis Communication, Exploring Indonesians' Motivations to Use Dual Screening During a Terrorist Attacks. Okay, so here is the research cycle that we always do. We read, write, drink coffee, repeat, and again and again and again. So this certainly kind of like reflects what I and many people do. But before we talk about my research further, I would like to first share personal story on how I gained my research experience. Actually, it was started when I first enrolled at IMEX. So like I once ever sat the same chair as you. First learned how to conduct a research from the class projects. And on my second semester, I started to work as a research assistant for Professor Lin. And at the end of the second semester, actually, I asked Professor Lin to be my supervisor, and she agreed. And then we started to work on my master's thesis, which I kind of like will talk about today. So it's always kind of like a loop. Once you already start a project, you suddenly get inspired and then work on another project. And that's why you will keep repeating this research cycle, which is actually really fun because you learn a lot of new things. And my research mostly evolves around new media and social change in the context of politics, crisis, and health. Why new media? Because I know that Indonesia, my home country, is a big market for social media, and I myself is a very heavy social media user. So I think it's good to conduct a study about something close to me, as I have a prior knowledge about that, and it's like something that I'm passionate about. I think it's going to be helpful for my future job if I would like to be an academician or even working in the industry as a social media analyst. So I study about the implications of social media, especially in the context of politics. However, when I start my master thesis, I observed that there were actually lots of terrorist attacks happening in my home country, and social media plays an integral role in the crisis response process, which then leads me to research more about crisis and disaster. And only until recently, I developed an interest in health communication as well. So the main takeaways is that, in my humble opinion, when you are confused about what you should study, you can actually start from something that you are interested in. It can be social media, it can be journalism, or it can be video games or movies. That can be a very good start for you to find a research topic. And then when you already find the general topic, you can actually narrow it down and find a more specific direction. A professor here in CTU gave us a really good advice about how to shape our research. So she suggested us to go back to the Laswell's model of communication. If you are not familiar with the model, it basically contains the elements of communication, including source, message, medium, audience, and effect. And then to find the research directions, more specific research directions, we can see which component of communication we want to focus on. So for instance, if you are interested in journalism, there can be many directions, right? And then you can focus on the source, which is like the journalist, and study the practice of the journalist, which I think will be discussed by Fabi after this. Or if you are interested in the message, you can conduct the content analysis to actually analyze the content of the message or the media. So you can pick which components that you are interested in that will help you guide your research. And so from my own experience, there are times that actually, aside from your own personal interests, you can get an idea of your research from talking to your supervisor. For instance, in my case, I actually first know about the topic that I will talk today, the dual screening, from the new media convergence class. And I thought it was like a really cool and emerging concept. In case you don't know about what dual screening is, it is the use of two screens at the same time. One screen device to engage in social and communication activities while viewing audiovisual content on another screen. So basically, like you are watching TV while you are using your phone to chat with your friends. But to be honest, in the beginning, I have not thought about conducting a research about dual screening. Then one day I was talking to Professor Lind and then gave my proposed topic related to social media for politics. And then she suggested that I could actually use the concept of dual screening instead of like social media only in the context of politics. So don't be afraid to talk about your research to your supervisor or peers because inspiration can certainly come from other people as well. And sorry, afterward, I collected all literature about dual screening and read them. But then during the process, I learned that there was a terrorist attacks happening in my country, particularly in Kampung Melayu bus station in Jakarta. And based on the literature, there is actually an indication of the use of dual screening in response to terrorism. And hence, I discussed again with Professor Lin, and we agreed to change my topic to crisis communication. So I want to let you know that first, it is important to read more literature to improve your idea. And second of all, changing topic during the process of developing your research is certainly a normal practice. So don't be afraid to do that. After finding out your research direction, we develop the research objective and also questions. From my own experience, I read literature again to the topic that I'm interested in and see what has been done and what has not been done. So the things that have not been done can be actually a good direction for you because it shows that your research letter will have good contribution as you fill the research gap. And based on this research gap, we can define our research purpose and also questions. For instance, in my case, during the literature review, I become aware that dual screening has attracted many scholarly attention, as many studies have been examined the motivations of dual screening use, the effects of dual screening on users' attitude, and its implications. However, most studies are conducted in the context of politics and entertainment, while investigations of dual screening use for disaster or crisis communication is still relatively scant. So I also noticed that people use media differently for political and crisis-related purposes. For instance, past studies examining dual screening for politics mostly found that individuals consume two screens at the same time for informational and social purposes, such as like seeking information while talking to others. However, the context of crisis over additional perspective in looking at people's motivations to use dual screening as emergency influences people's affection and emotion, and therefore the distressed individuals need to use media to respond to the crisis and cope with the emergencies. So based on this literature, there are actually like three primary factors that drive dual screening adoption during terrorist attacks, which are social, cognitive, and affective motives, but they have not been empirically tested. Given that it can actually be a really good direction for me to study this, and we then define the purpose, which is we would like to investigate the motivation of dual screening use for crisis communication. In particular, we inquire what motivated Indonesians to use dual screening during terrorist attacks, whether it's affective, cognitive, or social motives. And as I said earlier, because we feel research gap, there is like a contribution for this study as this study advances the literature of dual screening by extending its applications for crisis and disaster communications. And the findings are also insightful for the government and other organizations in designing the crisis response campaign, especially in determining effective channels and message to reach the public in the aftermath of terrorist attacks. Then after that, after defining our research questions and then topics, it's time to decide what approach you want to use to conduct your study or what method that you would like to employ for your study. In regard to the approach, it can be a qualitative and it can be quantitative, or now there is also a trend of using computational approach, especially if it involves big data. If you are interested about computational approach, I highly recommend this book by Salganik, which is also like recommended by a professor here. And in CT, we also have like a web mining lab for computational studies. We have a workshop for computational. It has been conducted in 2019, but there is actually tutorial videos and slides if you are interested and if you want to learn more about computational method. Anyway, after deciding the approach, you need to decide the best way to collect the data. You can collect the data on your own using survey, interview, focus group discussions, and others. Or recently, there are like lots of databases providing data set that you can use, such as the Pew Internet and Taiwan Communication Survey. You can certainly use these secondary data sets as well. Then lastly, you can decide the data analysis based on the data that you have and your research questions. My humble suggestion in deciding the research method is to find the method that can best answer your research questions. There is no other way and no other suggestion aside from doing that. For instance, in my case, since this is a like a relatively new study, it's better to conduct an interview to answer the research questions so I can gain further insights about the motivations of dual screening used during terrorist attacks in case there are actually other motivations that have not been discussed by the existing study. Also, my very second suggestion is that don't take an easy way out. If the approach is complicated, but it can actually give you a better insight and you can actually do it, then I highly suggest to do it. For instance, again, in my experience, the paper that I'll talk today is actually like a part of a larger project combining both qualitative and quantitative approach. So aside from the interviews that I will talk today, I also did Twitter content analysis of 7,000 tweets, which is exhausting, but it gives a rich insight about the dual screening used during crisis. But for today's sharing, I don't want to confuse you, so I will focus more on the in-depth interviews result. And we basically conducted in-depth interviews with 21 people, which lasted 30 to 60 minutes in Indonesian and also in English. Okay, then moving on to the research itself. We also set several criteria in recruiting the participants. We have 3 different groups of target participants, including digital participants, journalists, and also incident-related actors like bystanders, family, or friends of the victims. The reasons why we recruited these 3 different groups is because the extent to which someone experienced the crisis will affect their media behavior. Hence, we would like to compare the media behavior from these 3 different groups. So each group has 7 participants, and in total, we have 21 participants. They also must be active dual screeners who own at least 2 screen devices and experience dual screening during the Kampung Melayu bombing attack. Their age range is 20 to 35, which is the biggest age group of dual screeners in Indonesia. And we employed purposive and also snowball samplings to recruit our participants. The participants were all, again, active dual screeners using dual screening 5 hours a day, which is relatively high, and predominantly female. And the average age was 26 years old. To analyze the interview data, we use manual coding with thematic analysis, and the coding scheme was developed using a hybrid approach, combining deductive approach, which we generate the codes from the existing framework, and also inductive approach, which involves emerging codes from the data. In total, we had 3 codes: social motives, cognitive motives, and affective motives, and also 10 subcodes. So for social motives, here's the coding scheme to analyze the data. Basically, the social motives comprise of social presence, social capital, sociability, and social change, while the cognitive motives include information seeking, information appraisal, and information sharing. And lastly, affective motives consist of emotional support and also venting. Now, let me quickly share to you the findings of the study about these motivations to use dual screening for terrorist attacks. First of all, regarding the general behavior of dual screening used during terrorist attacks, it is worth noting that during the terrorist attack, the participants mostly used televisions to watch breaking news and smartphones to use WhatsApp or Twitter to communicate with others or to obtain additional information in the aftermath of terrorist attacks. And going to the motive of dual screening use, the first motive is perceived social capital, or resources embedded in social structure which are accessed or mobilized in purposive actions. There are 2 different kinds of social capital. It can be bonding social capital, which is like an exchange of resources with your strong ties, like family members or friends. And it can be bridging social capital, which is performed with the weak ties, such as social media and followers. So the difference is only between whether it's you with your friends or family, or it's with you with strangers or with the weak ties. The findings of our study found that all incident-related actors and the journalists agreed that they did dual screening to actually connect with their family members and friends, which was a form of bonding social capital. They needed to communicate with their close ties, to share information, display caring, and remind each other to stay safe. Moreover, only 2 participants admitted breaching social capital motivated dual screening use during terrorist attacks, as they intensely communicated with their close ties and rarely interacted with the weak ties. They intensely communicate, yeah. On the other hand, only 3 respondents from the digital participants were motivated to use dual screening because of perceived bonding capital. One of the participants revealed that her family members were actually busy with their own smartphones during the incidents, which then prevented them to bond social capital. Hence, they turned to social media for bridging social capital with their social media friends. The second social motive is perceived social presence, or the feeling of closeness and connectedness with others without being physically together. Many incident-related actors and journalists experience social presence of their close ties during the dual screening use, which in turn motivated them to keep dual screening in the wake of the terrorist attacks. The sense of others' presence indirectly helped them to calm themselves and make them less worried, as they thought they did not get through this chaotic situation alone. However, only half of digital participants admitted that perceived social presence motivated them to perform dual screening. The sense of others people's presence emerged when they had interactions with the weak ties on social media, but the other half of digital participants did not actually develop the feeling of companionship, as people surrounding them put less attention on the incident. Thus, they had fewer interactions related to this topic. Another social dimension leading to dual screening use was sociability, which is like the ease of and comfort of having interaction through technology-mediated environment. Most participants, regardless the group, agreed that they were comfortable in having interactions through dual screening, as this media practice was able to facilitate their information seeking and communication with other people at the same time. For this reason, they were motivated to engage in this behavior. Moreover, they did not actually encounter major technical issues during their dual screening experience. Thus, no critical factors prohibited them from engaging in using dual screens concurrently. However, some participants felt that they they felt uncomfortable interacting through open social networking sites like Twitter because these platforms are publicly accessible, and the participants were afraid of being judged by other people, or they provoke panic during the terrorist attacks if they share something on this open channel. The last social motive is social change, which actually a subcode that emerged during the analysis and prevalent among the digital participants or the people that actually talk about the crisis, the terrorist attacks on social media. 3 of 7 digital participants and 1 incident-related actors who was also a Twitter user stated that they utilized dual screening to actually encourage the public to make a difference. So they promoted these narratives through Twitter due to this ability to reach many people in a short time. Several appeals were posted by them, for instance, like encouraging others to stop circulating images of the victims. Or one participant said that when she was like watching the breaking news, she saw that lots of people actually gathered in the bombing location. So she used Twitter to remind others to stay away from the bombing location because there might be a possibility that there is like a subsequent bombing attack. Other than social motives, cognitive aspects also stimulated dual screening use. Drawing from the interview data, participants from all groups agreed that they did dual screening use to acquire information regarding the Kampong Melayu terrorist attacks. By obtaining enough information about the bombing attack, it could indulge that it could kind of fulfill their curiosity, as most importantly, they could anticipate future incidents and learn from the current event. While most participants obtain information from TV, they also use other channels to acquire the crisis information, so like online news portals for incident-related actors, Twitter for digital participants, and WhatsApp group chats for the journalists. Moreover, different groups also had different purposes for informational seeking. For instance, incident-related actors search more information to anticipate future incidents and also to avoid the danger, while digital participants wanted to know the details and anticipate future events, and the journalists mostly for the work purposes. Despite having information from many platforms, all participants also agreed that they would like to gain additional information and verify the information that they've previously collected. This indicated another informational purpose of dual screening, which is informational appraisal. Many participants from all groups felt that TV as the primary channel during the crisis did not provide them enough information, and they need to use other platforms such as online news portal and social media to look for further information that was not covered by TV. Apart from that, under a crisis, there were lots of uncertainties and fake news circulating on social networking sites, and hence it was necessary for them to verify and recheck the information that they acquired through multiple channels facilitated by the dual screening use. Many participants across all groups also dual screened to disseminate various information to their networking site, to their and networking circle. For incident-related actors, they inform others about their condition while monitoring the situations as they were directly affected by the event. There was a need to share their current state to their circle to make them less worried, and also therefore they engage in dual screening because they need to use the mobile instant messengers for these purposes. And 4 participants in this group also did a safety check-in via crisis response feature on Facebook to share their conditions with a broader circle. And 4 of 7 digital participants also say that they use dual screening to spread information to others, mainly to let others know or increase the awareness about the incidents. While for the journalists, they admitted that they utilized dual screening to relay the news regarding terrorist attacks to others. Most participants gave some information to their inner circle to reduce their panic or to clarify if there was a wrong information. The journalists also circulated the information in the working WhatsApp group chat. So they have like a group chat dedicated for work only. And it was a ritual for them to kind of like keep updating information with their colleagues for the work purposes. The last motive is the affective motives, and it's crucial for dual screeners to actually use dual screening to exchange emotional support. So for incident-related actors, emotional support or sustenance from others help them to cope with the stressful situations that they went through. And these emotional aids could be derived from the interactions through dual screening, especially with their family and friends who show their care and attention through interactions with mobile instant messengers. However, they did dual screening not only to solicit support, but also to give emotional aids, such as reassuring others who will also resided around the bombing area using the mobile applications. Among digital participants, 4 of 7 participants expressed that their sorry, 4 of 7 participants expressed their emotional support, such as extending condolences through Twitter. Moreover, 43% of digital participants also felt emotionally supported, especially when someone replied or retweeted their post on Twitter. Therefore, they engaged in dual screening. Similarly, all journalists also receive and gave emotional support using dual screening. They felt that their colleagues care about them by reminding them to be careful during the assignment and also something like that. On the other hand, they also showed affection to their friends who were also in the location by asking them to take care via mobile instant messenger. And only one journalist actually posted his support to the fallen victim on open social media platforms like Instagram. The other journalists did not convey their condolences or prayers to the victims as they already expressed it in person. Lastly, the participants also used dual screen to fan their negative emotions as the bombings engendered negative feelings such as panic, shock, fright, and sadness. Interestingly, the incident-related actors and journalists refrained from sharing it through open social media platforms, as it could potentially make people even more worried about them. Also, for the journalists, it might not be professional if they actually express these negative emotions toward their events on open social media platform. In contrast, 57% of digital participants prefer to express their feelings openly in digital space, such as Twitter. Conveying these feelings on social media could calm themselves as they felt that they share their burden to their social media friends, and then it relieves their emotional strain. So those are the key findings and what are the key takeaways from the studies. The first, it is interesting to see that in the daily lives, actually, the participants mostly use 2 screens, phones and laptops for dual screening, but then they turn to TV during a crisis. It may happen because the swiftness of TV report and the visual cues offered by TV can be more convincing in times of terrorist attacks. Moreover, Indonesians still perceive TV credible in general, and there is also like a high penetration of TV in the country. Also, unlike the existing dual screening literature, this study finds that people engage in this hybrid media practice to actually deal with the negative psychological effects that they encounter by conveying or soliciting emotional support and venting the emotions as the coping mechanisms. Hence, on top of the informational and also social motives that has been widely explored by the dual screening literature, it's important to also add these emotional motives when we are talking about the context of a crisis or disaster. Moreover, again, in contrast to the existing literature that found the importance of bridging social capital or like exchange resources with your victims, this study actually discovers that people use dual screening more for bonding social capital during the crisis. This may happen because when people experience a crisis situation, they will first interact with their loved ones or their close ties, and hence bonding social capital occurs. It is also worth noting that the study discovers the use of dual screening for galvanizing social change. The exposure to video contents allow individuals to actually learn about the bombing incidents and identify the emerging social problems post-bombing attacks. And to address these issues, people access social media, which has been seen as an effective platforms to actually mobilize others and promote the change. However, this motivation appears prevalent only among digital participants as incident-related actors focus on themselves during the events while the journalists spend their time mostly for work. So I guess that's my sharing for today, and I will leave it to the floor for question and answer.
Thank you. I think it's a very good time management. So any question for Lucas or, friends here, classmates? I
One
think
question from my side. How common are terrorist attacks in Indonesia? Because from Germany, I don't have an overview over the political situation in Indonesia itself.
Oh, so you mean like why there is a terrorist attacks in Indonesia?
maybe
Are they
you can.
very common, like by quantity? Because is it just a one-time event which you analyzed, or are there, let's say, on a couple of attacks per year?
Right. So actually, in Indonesia, in the past, the attacks happened like before 2010. The attack happened like quite a lot. But then after that, I think like our government did a pretty good job. So the big terrorist attacks actually happen like almost annually. But in terms of the numbers, it's decreasing. But the last biggest terrorist attacks that happened actually back in 2018, and it was like a series of terrorist attacks of a family attacking three different churches, then followed by police headquarters, and then followed by an apartment. But then for this study, I focus on one time point, which is like back in 2017, Kampung Melayu bus stations. It was actually also a pretty big attack as it killed and injured like more than 10 people. And it garnered like lots of social media attention because then there was like hashtags like "We are not afraid," which is commonly used after terrorist attacks in Indonesia, that become a trending topic on Twitter.
Right?
Hopefully it
I
answers your question.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. I think actually we talk about the importance of the context. So the introduction, I remember when, Jeffrey, once upon a time when we're talking about presentation, I still think it's quite important to give the context to show the significance of the study, especially when we tackle the different country situation. So Lucas' first question will actually, I think, serve the good purposes. It's like good questions to show that you have to tell people how important is your research topic in the selected context that you are working on. And
Right.
otherwise, we don't know why it actually can be considered as crisis. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Sorry about that. I just cut this part of the research context last night when I was practicing. But true, if you write your paper, don't forget to write your context. It's really important.
Yeah, and then that's why actually this topic when Jeffrey proposed to me, and I think wow, that's a very unique situation, and we can use dual screening, which is the latest focus on the new types of communication ways using social media at the same time other screen to do socialization. So I think communication plus socialization will be very important, double like a two tracks. During a crisis, you want to talk to different kinds of people among different kinds of groups. So can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned that you have three different groups, right? And why initially you want to consider three different kinds of group, and how do you recruit them, and the challenges and importance?
Okay. Um, so initially, when we are doing a literature review, we found that actually different people act differently during a crisis situation. So there are like lots of people that actually do not really care about the terrorist attacks. But then when you are actually in the locations, you will feel differently, right? So that's why there is a literature suggesting that there are different types of groups that will actually involve and engage in different media behaviors during a disaster or crisis situation. And the more direct their experience toward the crisis, the more involved they are. And therefore, we divided them into like several layers. The first one is actually, we call it incident-related actors, which comprise of affected residents and also their close ties, such as family members, friends, or also the bystanders, people who are in the locations of the bombing attack during the time. Second of all is the journalists, although they did not experience it directly, but they actually came to the location, so they are there. And lastly is the digital participants. So it kind of like represents the general public, but they shows their kind of involvement as they are actually talking about the incidents on social media platforms. So then we group them into three different groups because as you can see, the findings also show some similarities and so differences between these three among these three groups.
Okay.
And to I should really say that it's also challenging to actually recruit the participants because like there are three different people, a three different group of publics that we involve here, and therefore we use three different strategies in recruiting the participants. For digital participants, as I've mentioned earlier, actually aside from interviewing, I conducted a Twitter content analysis. So I send them a DM on Twitter and then send those a DM for like those who are talking about these terrorist attacks, and then invite them for the interview. Then I got like 7 people recruited from that platform. And then for the local journalists, I contacted the journalists that appear or like wrote the articles on Twitter, and then do a snowball sampling after that, like asking the recommendations for other journalists that like also involved in the reporting the situation. And for the incident with actors, this is the most challenging one. I first like observe the data and see who are actually in the locations. And then as I've mentioned earlier, there is like this crisis response feature on Facebook. So those who actually save, they put like mark safe on Facebook, and then I contacted them aside from doing an advertisement on social media to see who are actually like involved as affected residents or affected individuals during this terrorist attacks in particular.
Yeah, thank you. Why I asked Jeffrey, actually, I just want to let you understand, if you are just looking at so-called 21 young people, dual screening users, and you don't differentiate different groups, then you cannot tell what the major, maybe here talking about engagement, but engagement based on what? Maybe that's some war role, or that's something like related to the incident. There are different kinds of people actually involved. If you can choose, maybe you can also choose one particular, like a local journalist. If you want to looking at the news reporting and how they use the communication ideal screening to actually for work. It's like different motivations. If you want to essential, certain kinds of people, that's okay. But 21 person, if you want to looking at the groups, then meaning they have different characteristics. And based on the analysis for the maybe the motivations or behaviors, you can see some interesting comparisons coming out. Yeah. So the way how you approach and then the data you collect for different kind of purposes. Yeah, but that's very difficult, especially for the incident-related actors. So Jeffrey spent lots of time to recruit. So the most easier way is to just ask the digital participants, whoever want to comment on this, but their answers to the specific research may not be most valuable because they are very remote. They just feel like, oh, I'm the observers. I'm just someone on the internet. Yeah. So I forced Jeffrey to think about the groups, and I think it actually could I think reach insights and different layers to the outcomes. Any other question? Anything is that difficult to understand? Because I think you may ask another question is that it sounds very conceptual in terms of the codes, right?
Oh,
Yeah, but this one is for the thesis, which means it has to be very academic. Yeah.
right.
So there are some examiners or the committee members who coming from more quantitative background as us. So when you are conducting this part, which is an interview, how come it looks very conceptual and then very systematic in terms of what kind of codes we are looking at, and then we actually develop based on the codes and then develop interview questions. And then so we will cover all the answers that reflecting the concept. The reason is that interview, I think, has very two extremes. One is very grounded theory type, which means it's more interpreted, and then not this kind of approach that I usually would suggest that Jeffrey or Fabi later on also you will see. From the digital review, there are some concept you want to ask, then you have to really thinking about interview question, reflecting the concept. Yeah, but the thing is a trade-off. Like Jeffrey, because of time, not sharing lots of interview quotes. So it sounds less story-like, less qualitative, human-like, but it's because of time. So I believe that I still remember Jeffrey wrote a lot of that in your paper, right?
Right. And
So,
the time and space.
so what do you think? I mean, right now, because the study you have done a couple of years ago, and then in terms of qualitative way of approach, using this, what kind of pros and cons that you have experienced or
Okay.
you would suggest? Yeah.
So actually, um, I kind of like do a combination of. So what I do, as Professor Lin says, is that we already like have our prior knowledge and like also develop like a prior concepts, but then we kept ourselves open if there are like emerging themes that comes during the analysis. For instance, the social change initially was not in the coding scheme, but then we found that the digital participants actually talk a lot about social change, and therefore it's important to add it here in the social motives. In regard to the pros and cons, I think like because we are doing like what we call hybrid approach, it actually gives you like a balance of like codes coming from the prior studies and then codes from the analysis. But the cons is that if you are in many times, if we are doing a deductive, we often to focus on our emerging our codes that we have developed before, and we are not sensitive enough to find the new codings or like the new findings during the analysis, which then makes it like imbalance. So if you are developing a hybrid approach, it's really important to be open during the analysis that there might be a new finding that you never expect that appeared during the process.
Mm-hmm. Good answer. So you have to be open-minded. Uh, this is based on the semi-structured questions. So basically, you will have the interview questions. While you ask people, you will still have contingent, spontaneous questions, follow-up questions like that. And then at the answers, you cannot just, okay, so I see social motive, I see social presence, anything just put under them. But there are something cannot be categorized, but keep repeating in your data, like social change that Jeffrey just mentioned. Then you have to be open to that and then have a new concept emerging from your data. So that's what actually Jeffrey emphasized. And I think he did a great job, as a master student in the final thesis, and also presented two papers in the international conferences. So any other questions?
Yes, from my side.
Oh,
Regarding the interviews, how did you find the journalists which you interviewed? Did you try to reverse engineer Twitter, for example? That means if a terrorist attack happened in the past, did you try to find who put out the first tweet or who tweeted on scene, for example, as a journalist from the incident?
Okay, so I think it's also like a benefit for me because I actually studied journalism before. So like I have some friends working in the industry, but then what I did was that I collected 7,000 tweets and then found some articles talking about the terrorist attacks and look at the people or the journalists that wrote that article. And then I contacted my friend working in that company or in that media asking whether they know this person. And then I contacted the person. So it's also kind of like a long process of recruiting the participants because for the journalists, we set the criteria that it must be a journalist that went to the location and also like experience and report these incidents. So that's like what I did for recruiting the journalists.
mhm. So this study actually is a mixed method. Jeffrey did not have the Twitter analysis in this report, right? In this sharing, but that's the overview part in the beginning, and then have the in-depth interviews as the second important part of the study. Yeah, and then that's why I remember when you share and you still have some photo, right? Twitter posts of the journalists and how they actually show how they feel on the side when they cover the story and witness the bombing, situation. So yes, what I'm saying is that today actually has still more to offer for one good study. Usually may not be reflecting just by one method. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Any other question, or we can thank Jeffrey being with us and then still leave the email that we can ask you if the students would like to
Oh,
contact you.
yeah, sure. Feel free to contact me on my email here.
Yeah, I think he learned a lot more after leaving NCCU because has like computational method and quantitative studies and R language and different kind of things. But today, I think what I asked him to share is what you actually can do more likely from like a new media class. Of course, this is the scale or the complexity of this concept or research design is not is beyond one class. Yeah, it's a thesis level, but it's a good like a middle level of difficulty compared with your the PhD or other work. Yeah, it's a good starting point for you to have something maybe can look at, think of. Yeah. Thank you very much, Jeffrey.
Thank you
Yeah,
very
and
much
wish you
again.
all the best and give me some updates of your good news. And
Oh,
yeah, good luck.
sure.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so
Jeffrey.
much.
Take care. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye bye. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. So now is our second sharing from Fabi. And Fabi also used to be the IMIX student and also my supervised thesis student. And she got one good paper that we published together. Is on the title just like this. Okay, so I think it's very interesting and latest development in terms of the newsroom, how they come back with the fake news. So without further ado, let's just welcome Fabi to start. Yes.
So hi everyone. As introduced, I'm Fabi. I graduated from NCCU back in 2019, and today I'll be sharing about my own experience in conducting research, specifically new media research, and also sharing some research tips and my research along with Dr. Lynn's based on my thesis, which is about Indonesian journalistic practice in the era of fake news. So today's session, as what I explained just now, I'll be sharing not only tips, but then I'll try to apply these tips and show it how I applied these tips to my own research. So first, I'll start with selecting the research topic. Basically, there are many ways on how we can select our research topic. We can start from looking at the current events, what are the trending topics, what is it that you're interested with. You can even brainstorm with your supervisors, your teammates. There are actually many ways how to get your research topic. And so when I start my thesis, which then led to this article publication, I was able to choose my topic based on several aspects. Because first, back then when I did this research, it was in 2018. At that time, fake news was and still is right now a trending issue, but then it became very viral back in 2017, 2018. Even in Indonesia, fake news became big back in 2016, 2017 when we had the governor election. It was a very big thing. It was a huge issue also for everyone here. I also observed that there was an increasing research publication about fake news, so disinformation, misinformation, and so forth. At the same time, just a background, since my research is about fake news practices, particularly scrutinizing on disaster fake news, a month before I chose this topic, there was this huge disaster in Indonesia. There was an earthquake. And during that time, there were so many fake news. It was highlighted by news media. Even on social media, people talk about it. And because of that, I searched for more information about it and found that, yes, it was true that there were so many disaster-related fake news back then. And at the same time, I find this topic interesting. I am interested to know how our journalists, how the Indonesian newsroom actually conducted or handled these fake news. And that is how I came across with my own research topic. So the first part of the research is the introduction. Basically, in the introduction section, you introduce your research. What is your research about? You can start with defining the important terms. So in my research, since I'm talking about fake news, I had to define what is fake news in my research. Because if you look at different or various papers, each papers have slightly different definition, different context, and so you have to be able to define your own important terms in your own paper. And basically, you have to introduce to your readers what is your research about. You have to provide relevant background. For example, your context, why you chose this topic, the importance of it. Why is this research something that you have to do? How can it contribute in terms of the theories or to practical contributions? And of course, last but not the least, you also have to slightly briefly address the research flow. You don't have to give the whole research flow or the research methodology, but in the introduction, you have to let the readers know what is the research about? How will you do it? For example, are you going to do content analysis? Is it a survey, interview, and what you expected from this methodology? And so, as I mentioned just now, in my own research, I define fake news as the false information intentionally produced by people with personal or malicious agenda. And so how I came across this definition, I read several literatures. I also uh, I also found that when we talk about fake news, there are actually many layers of it. So you have to be really mindful, have to be really cautious about your terms. Some term maybe they only have like one layer of meaning, one layer. But for example, in fake news, you have misinformation, disinformation. Even in Indonesia, we don't use the term hoax, but we don't use the term fake news, but we use the term hoax. And so with all these different definitions, quote unquote, this different meaning, how can you synthesize? How can you synthesize the meaning? And my last tip when you define what's the important terms, you have to know your research context. So as I mentioned before, in Indonesia, we don't use the term fake news. We use the term hoax. And so, but then I had to know what does hoax refers to. And when I found out, oh, turns out hoax is the same as fake news. It's only how the terms are being used, but the meaning is the same. And that is how I was able to come up with this definition. And then I provided some background on how fake news is a current digital issue. So fake news is not only problematic for us, the public. It's actually also a problem for the news media, because first I found that there was a decline of trust in news media. So the public tend to distrust the news media more and more. News professionals, they had to compete with fake news for audience attention. So on social media, you have false information, then you have the factual information. How the news professionals, they find it challenging when public not only read false information or fake news, but they believe in it. And moving on, since my research is in Indonesia, I have to address about fake news in Indonesia. So in Indonesia itself, fake news is a problem because first, we are one of the largest social media nations. We have one of the largest populations also. But at the same time, even though we have a huge population, have low digital literacy. So a lot of people, they own social media, they have smartphone, but then they cannot differentiate the information they receive. They tend to believe the information they received, especially if the information came from their own network. So if a friend, say A, received an information from his friend, he might believe it, even though he doesn't know whether it's true or not. And moving on, after introducing the research, the context, the research, the important terms, I identified the research gaps. Research gaps means that when you read various past papers, what are the gaps, or what are the parts that you think your research can fill in. So after reading many papers, I found that a lot of papers, they talk mostly about what is fake news. They define what is fake news. And a lot of research were mostly focused on political fake news or user-centric. User-centric meant like, does social media users know how to identify fake news, or what do they think about fake news? And also I found that many research were Western focused, so a lot of the research took place in the US or in Europe, meaning that we actually like research in Asian context. And that is how I came to identify the research gaps. I found that there were a lack of study addressing non-political fake news in Asian context, and secondly, how fake news is being handled by journalists or inside the newsrooms. And so here, I provided a brief introduction about my research site, which is Indonesia, because once again, fake news is broad. Each country might have its own challenges, its own fake news challenges. And so here I explain about Indonesia first and their news media system. So we actually, even though we have been independent for over 70 years, we were actually in the authoritarian regime until 1998. So only after 1998 that the news media achieved its own press freedom. And secondly, and I find this very important for my research later on, Indonesian newsrooms are oligarchic, meaning that it's our ownership, media ownership are concentrated. So only around 12 people own several media groups. And the problem is that they tend to be profit oriented, and they tend to have their own agenda. Next, since my research is about post-disaster fake news, I had to provide context also about post-disaster fake news. I had to introduce what the disaster is about, what happened, and so forth. So back in September 28, 2018, there was this huge earthquake at Palu City, which is a city in Indonesia. And just I think a day or 2 days after the earthquake happened, there were various types of fake news on social media. And so it was to the point that the government, the Ministry of Communication Information, had to hold a press conference to debunk several fake news. So after identifying the important parts, important definitions, giving the context, providing the information about the research site and the research gaps, I introduced the research purpose. So what is my research about? So based on the previous information, I first want to examine the information patterns and flows of post-disaster fake news articles via web observation. And why I chose this, because first, there's not much research about Indonesia, specifically Indonesian disaster fake news. It's very niche, it's very new. That is why we decided that before even jumping to the interview, we had to know first how were the articles published. Since these articles were published by news media, it could actually reflect how news media address fake news, although not 100%. But then you can see if there's a discrepancy between what my interviewee said, what the journalist said, and with what was actually published. And so, continuing from the first point, the second part of my study is to investigate the practice of debunking fake news. So, how did journalists debunk fake news in among three types of Indonesian news media? So, moving on to the literature review. In the literature review, for me, I usually collect relevant papers or informations to my research. So I check for recent papers and I compile them to see trends. So I compile and compare. So I can see what were the common methodologies, what were the research contexts, which countries were the research conducted, what were the results, and so forth. In the literature review, I also explore aspects related to my research. So, since even though I'm talking about fake news, we have to know that fake news, there are many aspects related, there are many dimensions related to fake news. We have to know more about journalism itself first. How does journalism generally see fake news? How newsroom usually see fake news? And also in this section, you can introduce your conceptual or theoretical framework. Basically, your conceptual framework guides your data collection and analysis. The framework shows how you're going to get the answers. How are you going to answer your RQ? So first part of my literature review, I talk about journalism values. Why I had to explore these values? Because once again, many fake news research focus on the Western journalism, and we had very little research about fake news in the context of Asian journalism. And so it's important to see if there are any differences first in journalism between these two cultures. And I found that in Asian journalism, they tend to advocate values, ideas, or changes, but they tend to downplay the role of watchdog. They tend to avoid conflict, so they prioritize harmony. And research has shown that in Western journalism, they feel that news media is the fourth estate, meaning that the media is separated from the government. They have the role as a watchdog, and they value press independence. They value objectivity, impartiality, and so forth. And so I narrowed down from Asian journalism to journalism in Indonesia. In here, we can see that it's true that journalism in Indonesia reflect certain values of the Asian journalism. For example, research found that Indonesian journalists tend to be conflict avoidant. So we tend to avoid writing controversial topics. We tend to avoid topics that uh, can be seen as problematic, because as a brief background, since Indonesia is a very polarized country, um, topics such as politics, religions, and race are very sensitive here. And so it's easy for people to kind of like misunderstand it, quote unquote, or like distort the real meaning of journalists. And so many journalists are actually pretty reluctant to write things that are very controversial. Although there are now more and more journalists who start to write controversial topics. But generally speaking, especially in conservative media, they tend to avoid conflicts. And as I mentioned just now, news media also became profit oriented. We also have laws that are ambiguous, and these laws can actually make journalists susceptible to lawsuits. They can actually get imprisoned. And that's also one of the reasons why journalists they tend to avoid conflicts or controversial topics. And so from Asian journalism to journalism in Indonesia, I next move to journalism in the context of disaster and fake news. Previous literatures found that uh, the role of journalists are very important in the aftermath of the disaster because the public relied on them for information. They relied them for updates. But at the same time, in the wake of disaster and fake news, journalists found themselves not only difficult to verify information, they had deadline pressures because it's a disaster, but at the same time, they knew that with the rise or with the proliferation of fake news, they knew that it would be even more challenging, even more pressing for them. And the next concept I would like to introduce is fact checking. So, just fact checking is closely related to fake news. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with it or not, but just a brief explanation. There's a difference between fact checking and news verification. Fact checking is usually used in the context of fake news. So after information became viral, certain professionals will fact check it. They will check whether it's factual or not. But on the other hand, news verification talks about what journalists had to do before they even publish the article. So these are two different concepts. And since these two different concepts both are tied to journalism, both are very closely related to journalism, but then they are different. And fact checking is more closely related to fake news. And that is why I had to define this in my paper too. I had to explain the differences. So this is just further elaboration. So in newsroom fact checking, we have these 5 stages on how journalists usually fact check fake news. And so in the context of my research, which is Indonesian newsroom during post-Palu disaster fake news, what journalists had to do was one, they had to publish news articles about the disaster itself. And secondly, they had to also fact check and debunk fake news. And so here, this is my conceptual model. So in here, I put the word reference because this is my reference model, which is known as the hierarchy of influences. So this model discusses 5 levels of influences that news professionals have. So when a journalist they publish an article, uh, they don't only publish because they want to publish it, but there are many factors. It could be their editors ask them to publish this information, or the editors could also ask them to frame them in certain ways, the news framing. At the same time, perhaps they operate in certain countries or certain cultures that maybe could find this topic interesting or controversial or problematic. So these are the levels that really influence the outcome of a news articles. And the importance of having a conceptual model is it first shapes the research framework. It shows how your research is going to be conducted. It guides your data collection analysis because, say, for example, you're doing an interview or you're doing a survey. You have it's not it's not like I could directly just ask people questions. I could not directly write up survey questions and send it to people. I have to base it on certain conceptual models, certain frameworks that are related to my own research. Yeah, so these are the tips as I mentioned just now. So how was I able to come with this conceptual model? So actually, when I wrote my thesis, I spent a lot of time at this part. So I couldn't find, I couldn't find the right conceptual model. It did not really fit with my research. It actually took me, I can't remember, but more than 4 or 5. Actually, my previous model got rejected several times too. So um, yeah, I was able to find this model based on my previous papers. Based on previous papers. So I read many papers, and turns out that when we're doing research about newsroom itself, this model was often used. And at the same time, you can synthesize various model. So in here, I only use one model, but in other research, depending on your topic, you can have 2 to 3 models. You can maybe omit certain aspects of the model and synthesize it and combine it with others. It all really depends on your research. And so, as I mentioned before, about omitting certain aspects of your framework, based on the 5 levels of HOI, I actually only use the first 3 levels. So I only use individuals, routine, and media organization. And the reason why I use this is because Uh, my research solely focused on newsrooms, so I don't really want to know what happened. Not really want to know, but my research was not about things outside the newsroom, and it was beyond my own capability to at that time. So we only chose the first 3 levels. But even though okay, but even though I did not use the last 2 levels for my own analysis, it doesn't mean that it's not important because these 2 levels still talk about uh, sorry, let me rephrase it. The last 2 levels can still influence newsroom, and even though I don't interview or I don't observe um, data or information related to these 2 levels, I still provide context. I still provide information related to these 2 levels, and all of this information could be found in the literature review. So moving on to the methodology and findings. Um, at the methodology section, basically you explain how the research was conducted, where the data were collected, how you analyze the data, and why you chose certain this methodology. In here, you address everything, you elaborate everything, you have to let the readers know the step-by-step method on how you conducted your research. And in for the findings, in here, usually in the findings section, you basically show your data result. So for example, I did observation and interview. In the findings section, I showed the readers what the result is all about. And just some tips on the findings here. You can use graph and chart to simplify data results. You basically focus mostly on the data and then try to avoid redundancy because results can be very long and it can get confusing. It can get confusing when you keep on being redundant. So here in my study, I have 2 studies. So in one research, you can have more than one study. So you can do methodology A and B or A, B, and C, or basically depending on your research. So in my research, my first study is about web observation, whereas my second study is about interview. And as mentioned before, since my study is related to news media, I had, but then in Indonesia we have so many news media, right? So how was I able to come up with, how was I able to select 3 news media? So first, I observe first which news media I would like to research. And then next, I found, I chose certain news media based on their, so for example, I think at the time I found around 6 to 7 news media, but then I narrowed it down to 3 because first it was difficult to contact them, but secondly because these 3 news media have different backgrounds. I will explain it later on, the differences. I found that okay, newsroom A, B, and C are very different, very distinct, so I chose these 3 news media. And next step, I had to confirm whether that these three news media did indeed publish articles related to the disaster fake news. And after confirming that they do have articles about it, I tried to contact them and see whether I could schedule an interview. And that is why if you look at this part here, it's important to identify more than the intended amount. So say I wanted to research three, I had to identify more than that in case that you couldn't contact one of them. And so these were the three news media I selected: Compass.com, Medcom.id, and Tempo.co. So here, as previously mentioned, they are different because if we look at their media type, their background, their company image, they are very different. For example, in Compass, what I meant by traditionally affiliated is their connection with the parent group. So Compass.com, they belong to this one whole big group, and they have their TV section, they have the newspaper section, but at the end, they still belong to one group. They share information, their editorials are pretty much the same. But if you go to tempo.co, they are independent, so they don't have any affiliation. And they are only online. They are the only online news media compared to these other two news media. And I would like to highlight about their background. Compass.com, it actually belongs to the largest media conglomerate in Indonesia. So the Compass Group is literally the biggest media group in Indonesia. Medcom.com, Medcom.id, their owner is actually part of a political party. So he is a politician too. Whereas for Tempo.co, they're not affiliated to any business or political party. After selecting which news media I wanted to research, I had to choose the case. Because during that time there were many fake news, right? So which fake news should I research? Which fake news should I choose? And these were the steps on how I selected them. So once again, similar. I observed first what were the fake news. I look for how viral each fake news was, and what the fake news was all about. And then I found that turns out turns out that the government was the first to begin debunking various fake news. So is so why did I put this here? After knowing that the government was the first to begin debunking the various fake news, I knew that before and after before the government's confirmation, there were many fake news. Even after the government's debunking, there were also many fake news. So I had to choose from this timeline, the timeline, which fake news should I analyze. And at the end, I came up with two salient cases. These two cases could be said as the most viral and most highlighted too. So these were the two fake news. I would just address this briefly. First, the aftershock fake news is disaster related. So it's fake news about the disaster itself. So there was this false information saying that there will be another earthquake at the site of disaster. And so it actually caused lots of panic because a lot of people were scared, right? They were scared, they were scared that another earthquake would happen or another tsunami would happen, because at that time, the fake news even mentioned about earthquake that could cause tsunami. Whereas the second case, FBI, or the Islamic Front Defender case, so FBI is a religious political organization in Indonesia. Um, and yeah, so since Indonesia is a Muslim majority country, news that are related to religion or politics are very sensitive. And so I categorize this case as a politically infused fake news. This case is actually more complicated than the previous one, but generally speaking, volunteers from FBI, they went to Palu to help to volunteer to help in evacuation, and so they posted a post on their Facebook that like something like, "We went to Palu and helped people," right? But then the government said that the photo they posted on Facebook was not taken at Palu. It was not taken at the site of disaster, and so it was labeled as quote unquote hoax. And of course, then this became very highly problematic. Certain supporters were not happy about this, and at the same, and so they kind of like use false information to attack the government back again. So moving on to the web observation, which is study one. This is my RQ. So usually the RQ can be written in the introduction section, or you can write it in the methodology section. It really depends on your writing style and how you want to present the information. So since the first study is about web observation, this is my RQ. I talk about the information flows and patterns mediated by online news. So what I did was, first, I explained that I conducted the observation only for 1 month. And why I chose 1 month? Because within 1 month, my observation found that the information were concentrated within this 1 month. So after a month, the conversation about Palu disaster fake news died down. So it was not relevant anymore to study beyond this timeline. Next, I use Google Trend tool to look for the information flow. So the information flow is about where the information came first, where did it appear first, and how it traveled across the online space. How did it travel before it died down again? So I use the Google Trend to know when the case became viral, when did they decline, and so forth. And after knowing the information flow, I had to look at information patterns. So the information patterns is specifically looking at how news articles uh, publish their content. How do they present the content? I look at which sources they cite, the time frame, and so forth. So the time frame in the sense that who was the first to debunk this fake news? Was it the government first or the news media first? And of course, I compare it based on the three news media. So yeah, I know it's a bit complex right now. Basically, I observe these two cases on the three news media I selected. And then because I selected these three news media, I had to analyze whether there were any distinct patterns within these three types of media. Were there any differences between media A, B, and C? So, okay, I'll be quicker. Um, So for the first study here, this is an example on how I conducted the study and how I presented the findings. So if we look at the Google Trend here for the first case, the disaster fake news, we can see that the government was the first to debunk the statement, which is on October 1. And what happened offline also were in line with what happened online, because we can see the spike here. But then my observation also found the rumors circulating even before the government debunked. So this implied that the government was the first to debunk the statement, followed by news reports. And what happened within these three news media? These three news media treated this case similarly. So they only wrote around 2 to 3 articles about it. They published it after the government, and basically they just debunked that there is no aftershock. There will be no tsunami. Be more mindful of information, and so forth. But if you look at the second case, which is politically related, it's actually more interesting here, because we can see that after the government published the press release, and they mentioned FBI, we can see the first spike here. And even though it quickly died down, the conversation still remains. It's not as static as the first research. And if we look here at how each news media treated this political infused fake news case, we can really see the difference here. If we look at the first news media, which is traditionally affiliated, is more conservative, they actually only publish one article. But if we look at the independent news media, tempo.co here, they published 7 articles, and they actually covered sites both from the government and from FBI compared to the first two news media. Moving on to the in-depth interview, in here, basically I interviewed journalists or news professionals from these three types of from the three news media, to understand and gain insights on how they handled this post-Palu disaster fake news. So first, before going to the interview, I had to create preliminary coding scheme. So the preliminary coding scheme is based on your theoretical framework. This code scheme will help you write the research, your interview questions. Next, of course, you have to schedule an interview, conduct interview, transcribe the recordings, and it's usually very, very time consuming here. It took me around 1 to 1.5 months to finish it all, and it took some time to transcribe too because it was in Indonesian, so I had to translate it, have it checked again before I can start analyzing. And it's after you have the data, you can start to analyze the data, identify the overarching themes, identify if there's any emerging themes too, anything interesting or significant findings. And since I have two methodologies, I had to triangulate the data. I triangulate the data by comparing my interview results with the web observation. So, for example, I remember one of the interviewees said, for example, if the interviewee said, our company is A, B, and C. So for fake news, we did A. But then turns out I couldn't find it even on the web observation. So this is what triangulation is all about. And lastly, I finalized the coding scheme. So after you do the analysis, you'll find emerging themes, and then you kind of like finalize your whole coding scheme again. So this is my interviewer list. The sampling is through snowball sampling, and I was only able to find 7 interviewees. It's very small, but at the same, it's very concentrated because these people are not only news professionals. These people work closely with the post-paro disaster fake news. So these people knew what happened back then. This is the coding scheme that I mentioned just now. Basically, coding scheme are basically uh, like themes you found in your research, but then you give labels to these themes. So in your research, you won't exactly find the word news professionalism. You won't exactly find the words such as information gathering. But then when you do the research, you found that yes, information gathering is part of their fake news combating strategy. And so how after I conducted my interview, I used thematic analysis to analyze the data. So similar as what I mentioned just now, thematic analysis is analyzing based on the coding scheme themes, and you look for the emerging overarching themes. So it's important here, these are some tips also on how to conduct thematic analysis. First, you have to clarify meaning from your interviewee. So sometimes interviewee, they tend to be very ambiguous, or they gave answers that were unclear. So you have to double check with them. Secondly, you also have to be more careful of the connotative meaning. Sometimes they won't exactly say the word, but they kind of imply that meaning. So we have to be really careful with it. And then themes for the codes might be all over the place, meaning that, for example, if you look at my coding scheme here, I started from individual level to organization level. But if you take a look at my interview data, the codes are all over the place. So we have to be very careful and arrange it properly after the analysis. So this is an example on how we can analyze interview data samples. In here, I asked them about how did the newsroom address the FBI fake news. This is an excerpt, so it's not the whole answers. But for example here, my interviewee said we only received direction from each HQ. So what does this imply? So it could mean that, oh, it's the higher ups that decide the topic if they only wait for directions. He even mentioned, I don't really know. Those on site had no idea about the fake news. So we can really see that even though previously he might say something about, he talked about how he handled fake news, but then later on he said that he had no idea about this fake news. He only knew about certain fake news, and he only received direction from HQ. So based on this, I analyzed that, okay, so perhaps for this news media, it's a very top-down system, and the editorial policy mainly dictates what the reporters have to report about. I will skim through this very quickly, but basically in the interview findings, this is how we can present the data. So, for example, in the individual level, I found that in terms of news professionalism, all respondents perceive their role as important. They agree that journalists are important in the age of fake news. They believe that Western journalism are important. They believe that news media have to be independent, they have to be objective, impartial, and so forth. But at the same time, when they came across politically infused disaster fake news, the FBI case, they find themselves actually in the middle of either abiding by their ideals or avoiding conflicts because they knew that if they um, publish articles related to FBI or religion related, it could be detrimental to their company. Since we have limited time, skip through this. Uh, I'll talk to I'll skip to this level, which is organizational level. So in this code scheme, this is where the patterns can is very distinct among these three news media. So if we see Compass.com, the first news media, they actually focus on avoiding problematic um, problematic news. I remember one of the assistant editor, she told me that it's true that even from the higher ups, they say anything related to religion, anything related to controversial topic, like minimize those kinds of publication. Whereas for the second group, the one with whose owner is a politician, it's very interesting because during web observation, I found that they actually did not publish a lot of information about disaster fake news, but they published a lot of information about how the media group or the owners group provided aid for provided help for the victims. So group, their name is, for example, media group. Media group A went to Palu and gave certain amount of money, for example. So I found lots of those articles. And lastly, for Tempo.co, which is the independent media organization, they take pride in investigative journalism. So all the respondents say that we are investigative journalists, we are independent, we're not affiliated, and so forth. And compared to the other two, yes, it's true that from the interview and the web observation, I found that they tried to be balanced. So instead of covering everything what the government said, so for example, they don't only cover or say, okay, government say fake news A is false. This is the truth. But they went ahead and they went and looked for other sources too, which the other two news media didn't do at all. And so moving to the last part of the research, which is discussion and conclusion. In the discussion section, you answer the research RQ. So in here, you answer your RQ, you discuss findings with different previous research. So are your findings in line with previous research or is it new? Or is your research unique to your country, for example, in Indonesia or in Taiwan? So is this, for example, I found, for example, your data showed that um, the result is different from a previous research. And then why is it different? Is it because the research context is different? Is it because the research site? We have to discuss it here in the discussion section. And so my own personal tip is that you have to identify findings that stood out. So what is it that surprised you? What were there any unexpected results that you did not expect at all? And you can discuss it here. And always refer back to your research site or context. And then you look for, sorry, you refer to your,
Bless you.
you, you refer to your research site or context. Um, Once again, you have to emphasize that what makes your research unique because it's conducted in this it's conducted in this context. It's conducted in this country. It's about this case. This is where you discuss it. So for me here, my first argue was about knowing what kind of information flows and patterns that occurred in the wake of disaster-related fake news. So in terms of information flows, like from where did information start and how it died down, the role of the fake news, the nature of fake news itself is important. So fake news that are disaster related, so it's purely disaster related, in here I would call them as low risk fake news. They tend to have a more linear information flow, meaning that it became viral, it got debunked, and then people accepted it. So it's pretty linear. But for political fake news, the information flow is very complicated. It's not linear. So it's more of like it became viral. People debunk it, but then some people chose to not believe it, or they chose to distort the meaning. And so you have another wave of fake news, another fake news, and then the government would debunk it again, and then another wave of fake news. So it's more continuous, it's more complicated. In terms of information pattern, for disaster fake news, all three news media, they relied on the government. So they believed that the government had the right to say when it comes to something related to disaster. They believed that the government had the access. But then in terms of risky fake news, which is political fake news in this case, traditional affiliated newsroom, they tend to play safe. So they chose to basically say, okay, the government said this is false. This is the facts, and they just stop there. But for the independent news media, they tend to investigate more on it. They are more daring, if I could say, I could use the word, yeah, they are more daring. They step out of the safe zone. So basically, here, I then in the discussion section, I will then elaborate the answers to my argue. For example, here, I mentioned that the news media relied on the government a lot, right, to fact check disaster fake news. So what does it suggest? What does it imply? So does it imply that the government still plays an important role? Because if you remember, I mentioned that Indonesia used to be in the authoritarian regime, meaning that there was a high level of censorship for the news media. So does that culture still stands, still prevails until now, or is it because they rely on the government because it is disaster? They felt that they don't know any insiders information or any inside information about the disaster. And so when I look for other literature review, previous research found that government is indeed seen as a reliable source even during disaster. Sorry, I also miss here, for example, here, news media, as I mentioned before, news media, especially the traditional one, the ones that only rely on government statement, it it is the complete opposite of their personal perception about their own ideals about journalists. So in the interview data, all of my interviewees say that journalists, we have to be the fourth estate. We have to abide by the Western journalism. We have to be independent. But then when when they keep on playing it safe and they keep on restating what the government say, it's questionable here. So does it mean that it is only idealized but it's not applicable? It is, uh, and basically we have to address it. You have to address it in your research. And lastly, for your RQ2, how did news professionals in different types of news media handle post-disaster fake news? So similar as I mentioned before, the three media, they handled aftershock fake news. Similar. So all three news media, it's treated pretty much the same, but then they dealt with political fake news differently. Once again, a newsroom which who are more independent, they tend to cover multiple sources to balance reports compared to the conservative newsroom. And lastly, editorial policies play a huge role. So, for example, in the traditionally affiliated newsroom, they tend to play safe because their editors say so, their higher ups say so. Avoid controversial topic. But for the investigative newsroom, Tempo.co, their editorials actually urge them to be more investigative, to urge them to be more provocative, to be more thought provoking. Yeah, so I summarized the whole research here. You can see from the left side, you have the disaster false information. You have so many disaster information. So the news media, how did they choose? They chose it based on the volume. Is it viral or is it not? What is the nature of the fake news? Is it high risk or low risk? And this aspect influenced news practice. So low risk fake news will be treated differently to high risk fake news. And so they will look for information, gather information, verify it, fact check fake news, and so forth, which ended in how they handle low risk and high risk fake news. Here I highlighted the differences between the three newsroom. And once again, these three newsroom practices were highly influenced by their editorial policy and their company culture. And so to conclude the research, in the conclusion, you summarize your research, you address research contributions, both theoretical and practical, and discuss the limitations and future studies. So for the limitations, for example, in my research, I say something about the amount of my interviewees, or I was only able to interview 3 news media. These are my limitations. And the future studies, usually we can suggest about doing this research in other countries, compare it with other contexts, other cases, disaster fake news and maybe health fake news, disaster fake news and political fake news, or we can use other methodologies or expand to other research topics. And so for my last part, I would like to share some research tips on how to conduct new media research. So first, it is important to look for a topic or study topics that you are interested. So you need to know what is it that I'm interested in with, something that you would like to commit the research to. Secondly, I think it is important to know your research topic. You have to really understand what is your research is all about, because your RQs can change accordingly. Like for me personally, my RQs change several times. Even after I finish my results and discussion, I still change the RQ, but the essence of my research is still the same. The third is to have a strong grasp on your methodology. So you have to know the reason why you chose this method, why I did survey, why I did content analysis, and so forth. How are you going to analyze the data? How will you collect the data? The fourth tip is to be critical with your data. So it is important to look beyond the face value. So actually, when I did my thesis, it took me some time to really be critical too. So at first, I would only see it as face value. So whatever it was being said, I would analyze it. But turns out it was not the proper way to conduct research, because sometimes, as what I mentioned before, they have connotative meaning. You have to double check with your interviewees. So it's important to always be critical. The fifth is to ensure that you have the necessary resources, meaning that, for example, if you're doing an interviewee, especially with people that are more difficult to reach, you have to know first that you have the access, that you can actually get in contact with them. That is why, for me, because I do have some journalist friend and I used to intern at a news media, I already had the access to it. The sixth tip is to reread all your writings. This is also very important. Like for me, I also had to reread so many times because turns out some writings were redundant. There were mistakes. Basically, some parts became unclear. So yeah, you can ask your friends to help proofread for you, or basically just to reread. Just the seventh tip is data collection analysis usually takes the longest time, but don't be discouraged, because once again, for me, it took months, like from conducting the interview, conducting the observation, cleaning the data, analyzing data. It took 2 to 3 months. I think it went more than that. And there were times when it's easy to feel discouraged, especially with the amount of data you have, and yeah, it just gets complicated at times. But don't be discouraged. It'll all turn well at the end. And the eighth is it takes time for your research to take shape. So keep on writing. So what I mean here is that as you do your research, sometimes it feels like, for me personally, sometimes when I was writing my thesis and my paper, I find that I felt lost at times. I didn't know whether it would turn out good or not. So it takes time, but as you write and as you refine your writing, it will start to take shape. The ninth is to solidify research understanding by reading more journals and discussing. So when I first started to do research, I also had no idea how to do research. I had no experience in doing so. But as you read more journals, you get a sense of how research is conducted. You know that, oh, so this is how introduction is written. Um, this is how data is presented when you write your result. And when you discuss either with your professor, with your advisor, or even with your friends, it kind of like, sometimes it can give you more idea, it gives you more inspiration to write. And my last tip is just to enjoy the writing process, especially if you're preparing for a thesis or for your class paper, just enjoy the process of writing research. So this is the end of my presentation, and this is my email. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think I went a bit over time. Sorry.
It's okay. So you can tell that how Fabi spent lots of time and then painstakingly and never give up. And then in the end, she still said, enjoy the writing. So that's the spirit. Actually, she can achieve what she has achieved. And so she has 2 conference papers overseas and then also have 1 journal article published. And I think all along the way, lots of challenges, but we don't have time to go through that because so if you have really any questions, you can ask Fabi. But I would say it's not easy, and just think about how to improve the thesis, and with Miss Master, then eventually the fruits will be very sweet, just like what Fabi had right now, right? The smile say yes. Okay, so because lots of insights also provided 1 journal articles. I think that's part of the thesis that she has done. So you can read and then post it on the Moodle. And then you go home, you will have a small assignment and to think about your research topic. And the research topic has some tips shared by Jeffrey and the Fabi. I think they actually tell a lot. But when you have to do it by yourself, that's another story. You still will have to go through loss and found and what is variable, what is not. So just go home and think about whether you want to do it solo or with your classmate, and then think about 1 topic that you love, and then can carry on this semester and achieve something. So, Fabi, thank you. We are going to take a photo, and I won't ask question because you have done a great job, and then you have lots of in between tips, and then telling us all the steps that you have actually breakthrough or something that our classmates can pay attention to. Okay, so any question, write Fabi directly. All right, unless you have urgent things. I think because of time, perhaps we can just stop here and take a photo and say goodbye. Or Fabi, you want to say anything else?
I think I've said a lot.
Yeah, you said.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's
If
take
you
a
have any
photo.
questions, then just feel free to email me.
Okay, thank you, Fabi.
Yeah, no problem.